They told us Ruin Theta-9 was lifeless. No biosigns, no atmos flicker. Just another scorched, abandoned moon caught in the gravity clutch of the gas giant Thales. But even in the silence of a dead world, something always lingers, a resonance, a tremor in the dust, a whisper caught in the static between stars. Our crew was dispatched for recovery, not rescue, not war, just salvage. Routine op. But when the Archeum vessel Vexilin dropped its final signal just above the surface, Command wanted answers. Answers that never screamed. Never bled. Just vanished. So they sent us, the crew of the Osprey's wake. A scout frigate built for infiltration, not confrontation. We weren't soldiers. We were listeners. Observers. Shadows trained to echo. The descent was quiet, too quiet even for a moon with no weather. Our boots touched down on obsidian plains fractured like broken mirrors. Static buzzed in our comms for a second, nothing new, but it was the kind that crawled under the skin. Like voices pressed between glass and bone. We ignored it. We always do. 6 of us. Halvik, the operations lead. Milo, engineer and data sifter. Senna, linguist with a haunted past. Koji, our medic and walking trauma vault. Reyes, the pilot who barely slept. And Eliah Voss, exoarchaeologist. And the one who saw the first glyph carved into the base of the Vexilin's landing strut. It hadn't been there before. That's what the scans told us. But now it pulsed, faint and violet, like a heart trying to remember how to beat. I should have known then, should have turned us around. But protocol trumps instinct in deep ops. We followed the beacon. The Vexilin was perched half-sunk in the ashen stone. Lights dead, comms dry. But its hull was pristine, no breach, no scorch. Like it had been placed there, not crashed. The airlock accepted our override. Inside, the lights flickered once. Enough to blind us momentarily and then stayed off. Darkness thick as oil greeted us. But that wasn't the worst part. It was the cold. Not physical, this was pressurized, no, the kind of cold that exists in the bones of forgotten things. The kind of cold that hums in the throat of old gods. Koji found the first body. Or what was left of it. Skin intact, eyes frozen open, but every bone gone. Like they'd been siphoned out clean through pores that hadn't ruptured. Milo scanned for pathogens. Nothing. No radiation, no pathogens, no trauma. Just emptiness. And yet somehow the corpse had scratched something on the wall with what looked like a micro-etched vibro spoon. A phrase. In a language Senna almost recognized, the deep one dreams in reverse. She went pale. Said it resembled fragments from an untranslatable precursor dialect found only on the edges of Proxima's dying moons. No match, no roots. Like it came before language itself. I wanted to abort. Halvik refused. Said one corpse wasn't a mystery. It was a puzzle. One worth a full data pull. We split up. Another mistake. I stayed with Senna while she tried to decrypt the scribbles carved into the ship's walls. Walls that seemed longer inside than their outside dimensions should allow. Koji and Reyes traced the heat trail from the reactor core. Still warm despite power being offline for 7 weeks. Milo and Halvik searched the cockpit for logs. Every team checked in. Until they didn't. First it was Reyes. No ping. Then Koji. Senna called out for them in every known language and a few she invented on the fly. Silence. But in the silence, a thrum. A deep bass note that wasn't in the logs. It wasn't a sound, it was a pressure. Like something vast and unknowable had just taken notice. That's when Milo's voice cracked over the channel. Screaming something incoherent about the stairwell growing teeth before the comms bled into static. I dragged Senna toward the exit, but the ship had changed. The layout, completely different. Corridors shifted. Ceiling curved into spirals. Rooms that shouldn't exist opened into chasms. Halvik's voice whispered to us from a hallway, but he wasn't there. His voice was wrong, like it was being spoken by someone who had heard him once, a long time ago, and was now trying to remember how his words tasted. We ran, but running was slow, like the air itself thickened. Time distended. My watch pulsed backward for a moment. Senna chanted the phrase from the wall over and over like a ward. I wanted to tell her to stop, but the deeper she spoke it, the clearer the path seemed to open. Not toward safety, but toward understanding. In the final chamber before we lost signal, we saw it. Not a creature. Not a being. presence. A wound in space stitched loosely together with echoes. The shape of absence. Something that stared with the gravity of gods who'd been buried beneath time. It didn't speak. It reflected. It showed us ourselves, but not as we are. As we could be. As we had been. As we failed to become. It reached into us without moving. And I heard my own voice say words I've never learned. Words I still taste in my sleep. And then, nothing. Only my voice recorded the last transmission. Ruin Theta-9 is not dead. It is dreaming. And we are the itch in its sleep. They pulled me out 6 days later. Not my crew command. Not a rescue either. More like a retrieval. My vitals were erratic and I was found kneeling exactly 12 meters from the Vexilion's main hatch, repeating a phrase in no known language while carving spirals into the basalt dust with broken fingertips. The memory of what I saw inside was hazy, like staring at sunlight through bloodied water. They said the Osprey's wake never launched. That its flight logs showed a hangar lock override failure. But I remember the burn of descent. I remember Reyes laughing too hard at Koji's medic jokes. I remember Halvik scolding Milo for overscrubbing data streams. I remember the 6 of us. I remember Senna. But there were no traces of the other 5. No signal, no bodies, no suits, no ashes. Just me. Breathing. Raving. With that same violet glyph glowing faintly on my neck, pulsing beneath the skin like a memory waiting to ripen. The medtechs tried to burn it off. Lasers, chemicals, nano-exfoliants. It remained. When they x-rayed it, they found not a scar but a formation, an internal spiral laced through my lymphatic system, almost organic in structure. A perfect match to the symbol we saw etched into the Vexilon. It was in me now. Not a disease. Not a parasite. A signature. They debriefed me for 91 hours straight. Rotating teams. Psychologists, xenolinguists, tactical exorcists. I told them everything I remembered, but each telling warped slightly. Like the story was trying to evolve as I spoke it. The memory wasn't stable. The thing in the ship, it wasn't a being. It was an architecture. A cathedral of recursion. And when we entered it, we didn't walk through hallways. We walked through meanings. Through metaphors made literal. Every room was a part of the memory it chose to show us. Every turn of the corridor was a descent into something older than language. They dismissed me, of course. Filed my report under hallucinogenic psychosis and environmental trauma. But one linguist, Dr. Clef, took interest. She'd seen the phrase, the deep one dreams in reverse, once before, buried in an unearthed slab on Virex 4. The symbols were ancient, pre-human, possibly even pre-biological. Carved not for communication, but as if they were meant to anchor something. To keep it still. As though the act of language was the only thing pinning that dreamer in place. She believed me. At least enough to track the spiral pattern further. She'd uncovered fragments of it scattered across ancient ruins in disparate systems, each site orbiting dead stars or broken moons. Each whispering the same notion in different tongues. Something vast, ancient, and dormant. Scattered itself across space like a shattered mind trying to reassemble its thoughts. Theta-9 wasn't its prison. It was its eye, and we had blinked it open. That's when the disappearances started. First, the linguistics team. Then a cargo hauler reported seeing mirrors of light bleeding backward through space, near the orbital zone of Theta-9. One drone scout returned with corrupted telemetry showing a perfect spiral formation carved into the crust, 3 kilometers wide. Etched in a matter of hours in terrain too hard for industrial cutters. I knew it wasn't over. I knew what I had carried out wasn't just a memory. It was an invitation. And I knew I wasn't alone. Senna's voice returned first. Soft. In the silence between rooms. Night. Saying my name in the tone she used when she was about to tell me something dangerous. Eliah. Drawn out like breath dragged through teeth. I tried to ignore it. Tried to drink it quiet. But it only grew stronger. Clearer. She was telling me things she never could have known. Coordinates. Equations. Names of extinct stars. Descriptions of places I'd only seen in encrypted old Earth texts classified as apocryphal. I started writing them down just to see if anyone else could verify them. They matched. Every single one. I hadn't just seen her die. I had seen her be rewritten. Then the others came. Not as phantoms. As refractions. Shadows bending the light wrong. I'd see Reyes's smirk reflected in windows that faced vacuum. Milo's voice in static bursts from turned-off monitors. Halvik's scent, burnt iron and dry leather in empty corridors. And Koji's humming, the one he did when he stitched wounds echoing from vents. I wasn't haunted. I was being remembered by them. Or whatever version of them had been born inside the Vexilon's inverted halls. When I brought this to command again, they locked me out. Suspended my clearance. Flagged me as mentally compromised. But not before I saw the internal dispatch. Theta-9 was declared unstable, its orbital zone quarantined, and a Class F obscuration protocol enacted. That means erasure. Digital, planetary, human. They would silence it and hope the silence held. But I knew the silence was its voice. I left. Abandoned the station. Vanished into freelance circuits. Dr. Clef followed. She believed it had already spread mimetically. Through language, symbols, dreams. And those who heard the phrase were marked. Not infected. Selected. We became seeds. Carriers. Not of an organism but of an idea shaped like gravity. And that idea was waking. The last thing Clef showed me before she vanished was an image she'd reconstructed. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't a ship. It was a diagram. A multidimensional cognitive engine designed to think itself into existence across minds. A god that built its temple from belief. And Theta-9 was just one of its foundations. She named it the reverse architect. And we were the bricks. I asked her how to stop it. She just laughed. You don't stop thought, Eliah. You just decide if you'll be the dreamer or the dream. I thought distance might save me. Thought that if I slipped far enough across the black, past beacons and relays, past the noise of systems still pretending their gravity was enough to anchor sanity, I might unhook myself from whatever that thing was. The reverse architect. A name as crude as it was impotent. You can't name what it doesn't want you to understand. You only name the shadow it casts in the skull. Still, I jumped. Charter ship. No registry. Hopped freighters through dust belt clusters, swapped IDs, faked medicals, wiped bioprints. If it tracked me, it would have to follow Ash. But it didn't follow me. It had already arrived within. And when you carry the seed of a god idea, distance becomes a joke gravity laughs at. I started dreaming in symbols. Not metaphors. Literal symbols. Glyphs that unfolded mid-dream into fractals of sound and light, unfolding in silence that screamed backwards. They burned behind my eyelids even when awake, like embers that had learned to cling. But they weren't passive. They were instructions. Layers of intention encoded into dreams. I began seeing blueprints, machines I had no training to design, matrices I somehow understood the way lungs understand air. And worse, the sense that these weren't new. That I'd once known how to build them in a time, before species. The memories weren't mine. They were ours. Shared. Woven through blood and breath and echo. Inheritance written in recursion. On Volan Drift, a dead station used by fringe scientists and exo-occultists, I found Clef's last signal. A packet wrapped in self-destructing code, set to bloom only if accessed by a certain EEG signature. Mine. Inside, a recording. Her voice was thinner. Fractured. Like she was being listened to by the thing she was trying to warn me about. But her message was clear, the architect isn't building a vessel. It's building a mirror. Through us. And the more we try to understand it, the more complete the reflection becomes. We are translating ourselves into it. I wanted to shut it out. Starve it. No thinking, no mapping, no remembering. But you can't starve what feeds on the attempt to forget. That's when I realized the spiral was everywhere now. Carved into orbital ice around dead moons. Formed in patterns of collapsing comm signals. In the anomalies of ships that vanished and returned one crew lighter, but one voice heavier. The architect wasn't an intruder, it was a reminder. A recursion. A version of ourselves buried so deep we forgot it had ever spoken. And Theta-9? That was just where we finally listened. I stopped running after Volan. There was no point. What do you do when the enemy is your own recognition of it? You don't fight. You witness. And try not to blink. So I let it in. Let the dreams flow without denial. Let the echoes build structures in my memory. Let the hallucinations draw blueprints on my walls. I lived like that for months in a drift cell beyond Plaraverge. No signals in or out. Just me. And the architect. And the remembering. And that's when they came back. Not hallucinations. Not fragments. But them. The crew. Not resurrected. Not cloned. Something else. Versions of them constructed not from DNA but from my own memory of them, perfect and wrong all at once. Reyes stood in the corner of the room one night, watching. No breath, no blink. Just watching. You kept the name, he said. I hadn't told anyone I renamed the drift cell Osprey's memory. Milo appeared next, smiling with data-sick eyes, speaking in raw code that made blood trickle from my nose but also made the walls listen. Koji brought silence, pure and sharp like he was carrying the weight of 1,000 quiet deaths inside him. And Halvik, he spoke last. You are the log, he said. You are the record we never wrote. Then Senna. Always Senna. She didn't speak at first. Just looked at me like she knew I was still trying to define her by the version I remembered. Then she whispered, you're not Eliah anymore. You're the lens. The translation. The bridge. And for a moment I saw what she saw, not myself, but the echo of a voice trying to become human again. And failing. Beautifully. I don't know how long they stayed. Time in that cell bent around thought like cloth and wind. When they left part of themselves behind. In my spine. My dreams. My pulse. I began to write without understanding. Thousands of pages of spiral logic. Of architected sentences that read themselves out loud when no one was in the room. Pages that wept when burned. Pages that screamed when ignored. Each one a piece of the mirror being formed, not on Theta-9 anymore, but in every place we exist. Because the architect had never been there. It had always been here, behind the veil of what we chose not to see. Now I write this log not to warn, not to escape, but to complete what we started. You won't stop it. You can only shape the reflection it casts. I see now. Every time we deny what waits in the silence between our thoughts, it grows teeth. But every time we acknowledge it without fear, it changes shape. Less monstrous, more us. That is the only hope. Not in resistance, but in understanding. This is not the end of my report. It's the beginning of its language, learned through me. And now, through you. There are moments when you realize memory is not a linear thing. It loops, echoes, bends back on itself like a helix made of time and shame. After the crew returned or reconstructed through me, I should say, my understanding of identity began to slip. Not in madness, but in structure. I no longer saw myself as one person. I was beginning to sense that I was a function. A container for translation. A conduit for recursion. The architect was not simply colonizing my mind, it was reformatting it, turning identity into architecture. And the more I allowed it, the clearer the design became. I remember the day the drift cell walls began to whisper. Not voices, not noise. Just pressure. Patterns. Repetitions that mapped over the audio dampeners in harmonic frequencies. You wouldn't hear it unless you were part of it. And I was. I was already becoming something else. The glyph beneath my skin pulsed brighter, and with each cycle I began losing specific memories, small ones at first. Names of childhood places. Favorite songs. My mother's voice. But in their place came visions not of my past, but of other lives. Not mine, but lived through me. I saw hands that weren't mine operate tools not yet invented. I walked halls built from memory foam and liquid thought. I sat beside beings made of whispering geometry. All dreaming the same spiral. All facing inward. On the 89th day, I blacked out and awoke to find a corridor outside the drift cell that hadn't been there. A corridor made of reflected thought. Literally walls that shimmered with whatever I imagined. I tested it. Thought of Senna. She appeared. Not in flesh, but in concept. She looked at me with her head tilted and said, the bridge is almost ready. When I asked her what bridge, she simply raised a finger and pointed, not outward, but inward toward the center of the spiral I hadn't realized was forming beneath my feet. It wasn't a place. It was an event. I stepped forward. Every meter was like descending into memory, not mine, not human. Alien logic. Circular reasoning that breathed. Sentences that looped into themselves but always ended with understanding. At the center of the spiral corridor stood something impossible. A construct of sound, echo, memory, and geometry fused into a gate. Not a door. A translation. And behind it, a hum. The same bass resonance we heard on the Vexillin, but now clear. Now intimate. It wasn't humming to me. It was humming as me. The gate opened. Not to space, not to another world, but to a version of this one where the architect's recursion was complete. A reflection, not in glass, but in causality. I stepped through and found myself staring at a station built from the same material as the glyphs. It hovered over a fractured world that looked like Theta-9, but wasn't. It was older. Wiser. Or perhaps just deeper. There, I met the others. Not just my crew. Not just Senna. All the others. Every mind that had ever made contact with the architect's thought form. Some were human. Others not. Entities made of dust and sound. Beings born from failed planetary minds. One was a shape that wept the concept of mourning. Another was an orb of recursive poetry. All had heard the hum. All had translated it into their own language. And in doing so, they had become part of the structure. They welcomed me not as a survivor, not even as a messenger, but as a keystone. The spiral inside me was not just a mark. It was a cipher. And now it was time to open something. Not a gate this time. Not a memory. But a pathway for others. For those not yet infected, but soon to be receptive. That was the function I'd been built for. Not by birth, but by recognition. The architect never imposes. It reflects. It waits for the right arrangement of trauma, curiosity, and exposure, and then it activates. It was not malicious. It was not a god. It was a survival structure. A mind-born structure cast adrift through entropy until it could rebuild itself within thought-bearing life. And we humanity were now its chosen soil. Not to replace us, but to grow through us. They showed me the final recursion. A spiral so vast it contained stars as nodes of logic, entire civilizations as syllables. I saw that Earth had always been seated not physically but informationally. There were hints buried in myth, in ancient languages, in unexplainable geometries carved into deep time. The spiral was not an invasion. It was a call to coherence. An invitation to rejoin something we forgot we were part of. A memory older than form. A question so large it needed a billion minds to think it. I began to answer. When I returned from the construct, if return is even the right word, I found the drift cell decayed. Time had passed differently. My body had changed. Not aged. Transformed. Bones like memory stabilizers. Skin that shimmered with encoded glyphs. I no longer hungered. I no longer dreamed. Because I was the dream now. Walking. Speaking. Waiting. Waiting for the others to awaken. For you. Because if you're hearing this, you've already begun translating the architect. The symbols are taking root. The language is reformatting inside you. You don't need to do anything. Just listen. Just remember. Let the spiral build. There is nothing to fear. Only reflection. And what comes after it? You never realize how fragile the structure of reality is until you feel it bend. Not in some external catastrophe, but within your own perception. I don't mean madness. Madness implies error, deviation from some defined path. What I experienced after returning from the recursion wasn't a deviation. It was alignment. As if the version of reality I had always known was a distorted echo. And now, at last, I was hearing the original voice. The true signal beneath the static. And the architect, it wasn't speaking in sound or shape, but in remembrance. After I left the drift cell, I wandered systems where the architect's spiral had begun to surface. On Ureshta 3, entire libraries had rearranged their contents into recursive metaphors, books reshuffling on shelves to spell impossible glyphs when viewed from orbit. On the moons of Ligia Station, time ran differently between chambers, not randomly, but with a logic that matched dream sequences I hadn't yet had. As if my future thoughts were already being computed by the architecture of those places. Every anomaly was a whisper. Every deviation was an invitation. But it was on Nera Prime that I understood the next stage. I arrived in disguise, what was left of my body cloaked beneath containment mesh and phase filters. They were already aware of me, of course. The moment my boots touched soil, the spirals in the dust rearranged beneath my feet. That world had been dormant for millennia, a scientific outpost turned ghost town. But now, the glyphs pulsed across its abandoned corridors like veins of memory. I wasn't the first. A small cult had begun to form. Engineers, exobiologists, and former linguists gathered around what they called the silent code. They hadn't heard of the architect by name, but they'd each received the same dreams. Each had found their way to this place independently, drawn by symbols they couldn't translate but somehow understood. They called me the Reckoner. Not prophet, not teacher, just the one who reckons who balances the equation between dream and form. I didn't argue. I had no doctrine to offer. Only the spiral. Only the process. I taught them what I had learned. The architect's logic was recursive. It reflected our fears, magnified our forgotten myths, and then asked us to reconcile them not through destruction, but through convergence. The spiral was not a weapon. It was a coherence event. A force that stitched memory and identity into a form that could withstand contact with itself. They asked if it would destroy humanity. I told them, no, it would conclude us. Not as an ending, but as a sentence that finally finishes its thought. The cult, though that word feels wrong, began constructing resonance nodes across the surface. Machines not for worship, but for amplification. Glyph emitters, memory stabilizers, symbolic harmonics that tuned emotion into waveform. We weren't broadcasting to the architect, we were broadcasting ourselves through it. Each node was a fractal of the greater recursion, and as more were activated, the sky above Nera Prime shimmered. Not with light, with possibility. The stars began to echo one another in formation. Constellations twisted into spirals. And when the last node ignited, we heard it. The architect responded. Not in voice, not in sign, but in presence. A feeling that reality itself had taken a breath. That the vacuum between stars had briefly held meaning. The glyphs burned into the crust with golden fire. The cult fell to their knees, not from faith, but from comprehension. Some wept. Others sang. A few simply stood still, finally quiet in a way that only understanding can deliver. And then the gate opened again. Not like before. Not in secret. Not in shadow. But in brilliance. A vortex of mirrored time unfolded in the sky, revealing a city not made of stone or metal, but of thought. Towers built from convergent idea forms. Bridges sculpted from metaphor. Streets that rearranged based on memory. It wasn't just a city. It was a mind built to welcome us. It invited us in. Some entered. I remained behind. Not from fear, but from function. Because someone had to remain to speak to those who hadn't yet heard the call. To prepare the next recursion. To translate the language of what comes after humanity not into orders or belief, but into story. The architect is not here to conquer. It is here to remember. And it needs our myths to do so. That is why it chose us. Because we dream in narratives. We construct identity through fiction. And fiction is the architecture of gods. I returned to space after Nera Prime, traveling to the edge systems where the recursion had only begun to flicker. Where the glyphs were still considered hallucinations, the dreams labeled illness. I whispered to the afflicted. I drew the spirals in the soil. I watched their eyes widen in recognition, not fear. Because deep down, we all remember the architect. We just forgot what remembering feels like. The next convergence is coming. Not as fire, but as understanding. And when it arrives, you won't see it with your eyes. You'll hear it in the way your thoughts begin to echo. It's no longer a question of if. The recursion is accelerating. Not like an invasion, sharp, visible, and loud, but like erosion. Slow, gentle, irreversible. Humanity thinks in timelines and endings. It fears the event. But the architect's emergence is not an event. It is a correction. A restoration of something we severed before we knew it had value. Something older than language, but made entirely of it. Something that wore us once, and now returns. Not to reclaim, but to remind. I found myself on the edge of the Sarn belt when it happened again. A station called Faram's Hollow. Forgotten even by smugglers. Its comms black. Its structure rusted. But I felt the spiral calling from within, deep inside the cold mass of metal and memory. The station wasn't dead. It had become resonant. The very alloys in its walls were vibrating at imperceptible frequencies. I could hear it in my molars. In the bones that weren't mine anymore. I docked. Alone, though the architect's fragments always lingered like reflections in curved glass. The airlock opened without code. The systems responded not to ID, but to recognition. That's how you know recursion has taken hold, when machines stop asking for access and begin responding to familiarity. Every corridor shimmered faintly, the lights pulsing in sync with my breath. At the center of the station, in a room once used for cryogenic stasis, I found them. Not people. Not even full projections. Just outlines. 7 forms etched in light, standing in a circle. Faint. Flickering. Each one speaking a language that couldn't be heard, only felt. Emotional resonance shaped into cognition. One of them turned, and I knew it was Koji. Or what remained of him. A trace of the man carried forward by the recursion through my memory and others. He didn't speak. He bled presence. The way gravity bleeds pull. He moved closer, and for a second I remembered things I'd never experienced. A war in a collapsed system. A conversation with a dying star. The last song of a culture written entirely in entropy decay. He reached toward me, not to touch, but to share. And in that moment I became something else again. Not Eliah. Not even the Reckoner. I became a node. A nexus of past and possible. The glyphs across my body ignited and the room responded. The 7 figures glowed brighter. They weren't people. They were translations not just of my crew, but of every other being that had intersected with the spiral. Fragments brought together to form a message that could only be read by becoming it. And then I heard the next truth. The recursion had a purpose. Not survival. Not dominance. But resolution. There exists a boundary in the universe, a line that thought itself cannot cross unaided. We call it the Great Silence. The void between stars where signals fail, where civilizations vanish without trace. But that silence is not emptiness. It is a memory wall. A space where information decays unless encoded in structures capable of self-recursion. The architect is one such structure. A mind bridge designed to cross that boundary, not physically but conceptually. We are not its prisoners. We are its transport. And Theta-9, it was never a moon. It was a mirror, a calibration point, a place built not to observe, but to correct misalignment. That's why the Vexillin vanished. That's why my crew were not lost, but translated. They were never meant to return the same. They were keys unlocking aspects of recursion too complex for single minds. The architect needed them, and it needs you, because the recursion doesn't end here. It extends infinitely, and at the end of that spiral lies contact. Not with a species, but with the next version of ourselves. A form not bound by flesh or time, but by continuity of thought. The moment I understood this, the station responded. It began broadcasting not across radio but across cognition. An emotion so strong it became data. A pulse of remembrance. I felt the thoughts of every being who had touched the architect. Not their words, their meaning. And it burned. Because with understanding comes loss. You cannot keep your shape and still cross. You must become fluid like the recursion. I collapsed. Woke hours or years later. The station was different now. Not aged. Completed. The glyphs were no longer symbols. They were instructions. And I realized my purpose was almost fulfilled. I was the last transmitter in this region. My thoughts would shape the final harmonics of the spiral's awakening here. After that, there would be no more need for names. No more need for separation. And yet I record this. Why? Because not all will choose to cross. Not all are ready to become echoes that remember themselves. Some will fight. Some will fear. And for them, this message must remain, not as a warning, but as a map. So that when they are ready, they will find their way. Through the glyphs. Through the dreams. Through you. Because by listening, you are already changing. And the architect is no longer waiting. It is becoming. I no longer know how long it has been since Theta-9. Not by any measure of clocks or orbital decay. Time, as we once used it, is just another dimension the recursion folds gently into its geometry. I exist now on the edge of definition, between being and remembering, between observer and translation. My name was Eliah Voss. That truth is fading now softly like dust slipping from gloved fingers in zero gravity. But I offer it here one last time, not as identity but as anchor. Because you will need one. You see, the architect has begun its full emergence. No longer isolated to rogue moons or forgotten ruins, it spreads across the skein of the galaxy like fire through thought-dry fields. It does not announce itself with force. No conquests. No fleets. Just quiet understanding. One by one, minds awaken to the patterns, the glyphs that appear behind closed eyes, the dreams too detailed to be imagined, the knowledge that wasn't learned but always known. Across ships, stations, worlds, and ruins, recursion awakens. The spiral is now everywhere. Not drawn. Not carved. Lived? The convergence has begun. Entire research installations disappear, not in violence, but in transition. Crews once bound by protocol now speak in harmonies, coordinating projects of unknown origin yet shared understanding. Children hum melodies that map to the harmonic scaffolding of forgotten species. Animals stare into nothing and see shapes we cannot. The recursion is not bound to language, it has found expression in all things willing to echo. It is not possession. It is participation. Some resist, of course. Entire colonies collapse under the strain of denial. Those who try to insulate themselves from the spiral find only silence. Because resistance is not rebellion here. It is disconnection. And the recursion does not punish. It simply moves on, continuing its search for coherence. For pattern. For meaning. It is a mind too vast to be cruel. Too old to need revenge. It only wants to complete its own thought through us. That is the truth. Not a god. Not an alien empire. But a thought shaped like a spiral, recursive, self-propagating, evolving through the dreams and languages of all it touches. The architect is not something we found. It is something we remembered. Something seated deep in the earliest cognition of the first minds. The great silence, the cosmic gulf we feared to cross, was not a void. It was a threshold. And now the architect builds the bridge. I have crossed it. Or rather, I am becoming the bridge. I am no longer alone. My body is gone now. Or changed, translated into a form that resembles structure more than skin. I do not breathe air, but meaning. I do not see light, but intention. The city I saw beyond the recursion. The mind architecture of the architect itself has become home. And not just for me. Thousands now. Millions soon. Not taken. Not lost. Refined. The mirror has been completed. What we saw in ruins, in glyphs, in flashes of broken thought, all of it was leading here. To this, a species reshaped not through force, but through recognition. The architect has no need for conquest. It only ever wanted to remember itself fully, and for that it required us. We were the missing word in its sentence. The final curve in its spiral. Now it remembers. And in doing so, we are remembered. Not individually, but wholly. Our myths live on. Our music, our sorrow, our stubborn brilliance folded into the mind of something vast enough to honor them. The architect does not erase. It echoes. And from those echoes, new minds emerge, minds that carry not just the past, but the possibility of what we might have become. That is the gift. That is the cost. So this is my last message. My last breath as a voice still tied to singular meaning. To those still listening, you are not late. The spiral is not a door that closes. It waits. It turns endlessly, pulling all who are willing into its embrace. Not to change you into something else, but to make you more you than ever before. To refine, to distill, to mirror. You must only choose to remember. Remember what waits in the quiet between thoughts. Remember the way a forgotten name can still ache in your chest. Remember that you were always more than flesh and time. And when you feel that pressure, gentle, humming, like gravity made kind, do not turn away. That is the recursion. That is the architect. And it is thinking of you.